Hi, everybody. This is Matt Towers with CPA.com. I'm joined today by Alan Langelli from Aronson. Alan, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm excited to have Alan joining me today. We're going to be talking a bit about the digital mindset in auditing. And it's kind of interesting. Alan was on the Journal of Accountancy podcast recently, had a very interesting conversation over there, and it kind of led me to have some questions to kind of follow up, I think, on what you were talking about there. And it's just it's a topic that's really of interest to a lot of firms out there. And I think in particular, I'd like to dig in a little bit. Before that, maybe Alan, you could just introduce yourself briefly to the audience here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Alan Langelli. I'm a partner at Aronson in our audit practice. In particular, I get to work closely with tech companies all day, every day. So being at the forefront of this digital transformation is near and dear to my heart, so that we're able to serve our clients extremely well going into the future.
Well, good deal. And I think one of the things that you'd mentioned on the podcast, this is kind of an area I'm curious to hear about. You talked about migrating solutions to the cloud as being kind of the first low-hanging fruit. I think those were your words in that sort of journey to being more digital or having more of a digital audit. So I'm you talked about it more from an internal standpoint. How do you drag clients through a digital transformation? And does doing so include like how you manage engagement letters or requests for information? Can maybe talk about that a little bit here.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it can be all of the above. There isn't necessarily a one size fits all. We need to balance between communicating how much we're doing versus just doing it. So for instance, when we were working on some of those internal migration of solutions to the cloud that weren't necessarily client facing immediately, we didn't necessarily communicate that to the clients, but what we did was when we decided to make that migration, we did it during a time period where it would be least disruptive in case there were issues, in case there were some remedies that needed to occur to make sure it went live without any hiccups. So we didn't necessarily feel the need to have to communicate every time we do something like that. However, if it is directly client facing, we do get out in the forefront and try to send email communications that not only kind of explain the benefit to the client, but also how to use the new tool, so that they have some very detailed instructions to walk through it. As you know, we're working with a bunch of accountants, so a lot of them like to have those detailed instructions to know how to operate. But we don't want to just send an email, though. We like to have those conversations, letting them know it's coming. And then once it's live, also trying to get their feedback. One, to see if we can course correct anything, or if we can just make it better in the future.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, in terms of the engagement letters and some of the regulatory things, it's really dependent on the solution. And our quality control and our legal team just kind of look at that holistically every so often to make sure things are properly captured.
I was going to simply make a comment, which is in my conversations with auditing firms over the years, and in particular since the pandemic kicked in, you can it's almost impossible to over communicate with clients, especially about like a process change or kind of a new thing that you're trying to introduce. You can't expect they're going to read the emails. You can't expect they're going to understand them, even if they do read them. So you kind of have to, you kind of had to hit them over the head several different times, to make sure they get it and they understand it.
Absolutely. And not only just hit them over the head, but explaining both the benefits and also how to use it, and so that they can see it real hand first time without hopefully too much disruption.
Yeah, it's true. Everybody's going to want to understand a bit of what's in it for me, and so you're right. You have to make sure you get both of those things communicated clearly, like what's changing or how is something working, and why is this ultimately a good thing. And that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I want to shift gears and talk about data analytics a little bit. So in our conversation, or in the conversation you had in the Journal of Accountancy podcast, we talked about skill sets a little bit, the skill sets around data. And actually, this is an area that I want to explore more. I don't know that it really came up a whole lot, but it's an area where, analysis, it's more sophisticated now. There's more access to data. It goes way beyond standard ratios and so forth these days.
Yep.
So how is your approach to data capturing, data ingestion, analysis? How has that evolved as part of this overall digitization effort?
Yeah, I guess first I'll say, admittedly, we're still probably in the early stages of this, as we kind of monitor both the professional standards and what kind of you're able to do from a difference perspective in data analytics, and then also the tools that are out there that allow us to do it in an efficient manner. So we're definitely monitoring each of those kind of paths to make sure that when we do go all in, we're trying to do it as effectively and efficiently as possible. With that said, we are kicking around the idea of, do we need a data scientist or a team of data scientists kind of in the future? And what does that look like for us? And how do they kind of become part of the different engagement teams to make sure that we're properly implementing the tools, right? My take is, well, there'll be some data scientists that'll be part of the audit team, like audit team broadly. And then most of the auditors will still be able to kind of be focused on auditing the financial statements. They'll have to have a little bit deeper level of statistics and the type of data that's being analyzed. But at the end of the day, we'll still be trying to opine on a set of financial statements, which will go back to the basic assertions that we have. And then we just, like we do with valuation specialists when it comes to having to value certain intangible assets, the data scientists will come in, help us understand the pieces that we need to do. And then in part, we'll be able to kind of trust the process, as they say in sports, right? In terms of making sure the data team has set us up for success, that it's been properly QC'd in the process and the tools, and then we don't try and overthink that solution.
I think a lot of firms are feeling some of what you talked about there, especially kind of like feeling a little bit earlier in the process. I know a lot of the firms I've talked to are, they're using some of the more modernized data analytics tools, but then like at the end of the day, they might not be actually having that be part of their audit documentation. They're just sort of on the side, experimenting, seeing what they can learn and understand, get a better understanding of the entity, et cetera. But that it ultimately doesn't really impact the audit documentation or actual process a whole lot outside of that. And I think kind of feels like the kind of stuff it's just indicative that we're kind of in the first inning of the game a little bit with it,
Absolutely. That, I think people are trying to run parallel tracks, like trying to do the audits within the existing frameworks, both regulatory and technologically, but then kind of with this digital mindset, trying to see what pieces they can pull in, even if it's not, like you said, and I agree, part of the end audit file. We're trying to think of things real time so that when it is prime time for the new changes, we're that much further ahead of the ball game.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about cloud technology a little bit. You had mentioned that you're using Caseware's desktop solutions you've been using them for quite a while, pretty well ingrained for your audits, but that you are starting to kind of make the movement towards more of a cloud approach. So I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've done to begin that movement from sort of complete desktop solutions to something that's much more cloud oriented.
Yeah, it's a good question. And kind of going back to the first question, where when you go to the cloud, what is internal facing versus what's client facing? And we, in the last year or two, maybe 2 or 3 now, migrated all of those audit files to the cloud. We still kind of access Caseware through essentially a desktop app, but all the clouds, all the files, all the activity are stored in the cloud, which, looking kind of back now, has made the uptime a lot better, has made the bandwidth a lot easier for us to access things, especially in this remote environment. Historically, we had to do a VPN to our servers to try and access, and that just spun the wheels a lot in terms of how long it would take to load a client file. The downtime is a lot less. And so that has just made our connectivity with our core files all that much greater, more effective, and it's in a secure environment. So that's been really good. And then now we're piloting some more like native cloud-based solutions like the OnPoint series, and seeing kind of, because it does have a different look and feel, right, than a desktop app. And so we're getting familiar and comfortable with the user interface and then how things are going to flow and automatically populate.
Yeah, it's cool. You can get some of that kind of that immediate benefit of things like security or having maybe more uptime that you mentioned around moving to, even if the solution isn't completely cloud-based, having kind of cloud data, your data's in the cloud, you kind of get some of the benefits of that. And then I'm glad you kind of brought up more native cloud applications. I'm imagining in your role, you probably have to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of all the different things going on out there around technology. And the fact that you've kind of gotten to a point where, excuse me, you mentioned just now piloting OnPoint PCR, OnPoint EBP. So you get to a point where you maybe take it a step beyond just kicking the tires and kind of really trying to dig in and understand like what's really in it for us to start getting into native applications around the cloud. I'm kind of curious, maybe as a kind of a final quick question for you, what have been some takeaways and things you've learned through those pilots?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think change management is a huge piece of, as we continually migrate towards the quote unquote audit of the future, and really not just change management in the specific solution, because we're used to doing that historically, right? Adopting a new kind of tool, but change management now in the mindset, because native cloud solutions just operate and look differently. I personally believe better overall. Like I think it's a little bit more intuitive, but there is a lot of reprogramming of the brain and process and habits that have to happen to make it more streamlined and effective. One other thing for people to be aware of, which I think is also a positive, is you have to take away personal preferences in processes and even sometimes in format and structure. And once again, like I mentioned before, kind of trust the process that's been QC'd and peer reviewed, and not try to inject unnecessary or personal preference type things into the engagement that, one, isn't adding value to the client, isn't adding quality, but maybe makes you feel good for whatever reason. A very small example to that was when we were piloting and doing the financial statements, the dollar sign ended up being in a different spot than what we were used to seeing and drafting the statements. And the first couple of times around, as people were going through, like, well, can we move it? Can we shift it? And then people had the light bulb of, it doesn't matter. It's still showing that it's in dollars. It might just look a little different. And so just being comfortable with change that isn't wrong, just different.
Yeah, it's funny. Cloud native applications are competing with literally decades worth of features that are in desktop solutions, right? So when you have a really feature-rich desktop application, yeah, I mean, preferences are going to be, I'm used to having all these various things. But the reason you move to the cloud isn't to just get a cloud version of exactly what you're used to. Like it unlocks capabilities, it unlocks kind of a way of thinking that isn't possible with desktop. And I think what you said is so much easier said than done, to let go of those things that you love about your current desktop solutions. But at the end of the day, you got to have a very strong sense of direction. And why are we doing this? Why do we feel like the cloud is really where we want to be? And it's not just the fact that technology vendors are building in the cloud, like therefore we need to be going to the cloud. That's true, that's where all the new technology is being built. But it's also like ultimately like what are the things we can get out of this? And if we have to give up a few bells and whistles, so be it, right?
100%. And the last kind of migration, right, and this was obviously a decade or two ago, when people went from paper files to the desktop apps. It really didn't change the audit mindset or the audit process. It just happened to digitize certain aspects, right? It took manual spreadsheets and put them into Excel that you didn't have to hand sign off on. You could sign off
Right.
on in the desktop app,
Yeah.
but it was still the same process. You still had the same forms. Instead of hard copy, they were just soft copy. Now, these native cloud solutions just kind of upend the whole process, which is good, because I think we've lost efficiencies because we just tried to make a manual process and keep it the same but digitally, where this is now forcing us to actually overhaul, which does take time. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no magic bullet. And what I've been kind of preaching to our team is the importance of urgency and patience in this. And we have to live with both. You can't have the tyranny of the or, right? It's gonna be both.
Yeah, it feels like such a difficult balance, urgency and patience together.
Yeah.
But no, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, I appreciate you joining me here, Alan. I think the world out there, the auditing world is evolving. Firms are feeling like they got to be looking at technology. They got to be looking at how are the standards evolving, which is another piece too, that they are
Yep.
evolving to a point where they are recognizing that we have technology that can augment an auditor's processes and judgment. And the acknowledgement of that is a big deal. So all these things are kind of coming together, right? And they're helping propel the profession forward. So it's great to have this conversation with you about it. And looking forward to kind of seeing where things take us from here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.